Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling mysteries in American art history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you believe about the boundary between art and reality in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that consumed 3 generations of a wealthy New England family, where a single portrait defied all rational explanation and left a legacy so disturbing that painting itself was eventually sealed away from public view, condemned to exist in darkness for over 8 decades. It was the year 1938. Europe was spiraling toward the Second World War, with Hitler's annexation of Austria sending shockwaves across the Atlantic. In the United States, the Great Depression still gripped the nation, though some wealthy families remained insulated from the suffering. In Newport, Rhode Island, the situation was peculiar. The city's gilded mansions stood as monuments to an era of excess that seemed increasingly obscene against the backdrop of national poverty. Behind the iron gates and manicured hedges of these estates, old money families clung to their traditions, their secrets, and sometimes their curses. The Ashworth family had occupied Thornfield Manor since 1872. The estate sprawled across 12 acres of coastal property, a Gothic Revival masterpiece of gray stone and sharp angles that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 3 stories of mullioned windows stared out at the Atlantic like vacant eyes, and the interior was a labyrinth of wall, nut-paneled halls, hidden servants' passages, and rooms that hadn't been opened in decades. But it was one particular room, the eastern gallery on the 2nd floor, that held the portrait. Newport in the 1930s existed in a state of temporal suspension. While the rest of America struggled with breadlines and dust storms, the old families of Bellevue Avenue maintained their elaborate rituals. Summer balls, afternoon teas, yacht races. The Ashworths participated in these social performances, but there was something different about them, something the other families whispered about in powder rooms and smoking lounges. They were afraid of their own house. The manor itself seemed designed to inspire unease. Architect Richard Morris Hunt had created Thornfield as a wedding gift for Harrison Ashworth and his bride, Margaret Winthrop, in 1871. Hunt, famous for designing the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty and numerous Newport mansions, had poured his darker, aesthetic impulses into this particular commission. The result was a building that married Victorian grandeur with Gothic menace. The eastern gallery, where the portrait hung, stretched 40 feet in length, its walls covered in burgundy damask that had faded to the color of dried blood. A barrel, vaulted ceiling rose 15 feet overhead, decorated with plasterwork vines that seemed to writhe in lamplight. During the day, tall windows overlooked the cliffs and the churning Atlantic beyond, but at night, those same windows became mirrors reflecting the gallery back upon itself in an infinite, disorienting regression. The portrait occupied the place of honor at the gallery's far end, mounted in an ornate gilt frame that must have weighed 200 pounds. It depicted Margaret Winthrop Ashworth in her wedding dress, painted by the renowned portraitist William Merritt Chase in 1872, shortly after her marriage. In the painting, Margaret stood in 3/4 profile, her face turned slightly toward the viewer. Her wedding dress was an elaborate creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace, historically accurate to the smallest detail. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the aristocratic bones of her face. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips pressed together in an expression that might have been intended as serene composure, but came across as barely suppressed fury. But it was the eyes that arrested every viewer. They were dark, nearly black, and they watched. According to every account, every testimony, every desperate letter written over 3 generations. The eyes in that portrait watched. They followed movement. They tracked viewers across the room. And sometimes, when no one was looking directly at the canvas, the expression changed. Margaret Winthrop had been 22 years old when she married Harrison Ashworth, 30 years her senior. The marriage had been arranged by their families, as was common among the American aristocracy of the Gilded Age. Harrison was a railroad magnate, his fortune built on the backs of Irish and Chinese laborers who laid track across the expanding nation. Margaret came from old Puritan stock, a Boston Brahmin family whose lineage traced back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The wedding had been the social event of the 1870, one season, 300 guests, an orchestra, champagne flowing like water while, across the country, railroad workers died in accidents at a rate of 2 per day. The local newspapers described it as a fairy tale. No one reported what happened on the wedding night. The servants' gossip, preserved in letters and diary entries discovered decades later, painted a darker picture. Margaret had been heard screaming. The housekeeper reported that the bride's wedding dress had been torn. Harrison had emerged from the bridal suite with scratches on his face, explaining them away as the result of an encounter with a thorny rosebush during an evening walk. 3 days after the wedding, Margaret sat for her portrait. William Merritt Chase was at the height of his powers in 1872. A master of the American Impressionist movement, he commanded enormous fees and could pick and choose his subjects. Harrison Ashworth paid him $10,000 for the portrait, equivalent to over $250,000 in modern currency. Chase worked on the painting for 6 weeks, visiting Thornfield Manor 3 times per week for sessions that lasted hours. The artist's letters to his wife, preserved in the archives of American art, reveal his growing discomfort with the commission. "There is something deeply wrong in this house," he wrote in early October. "Mrs. Ashworth sits for me like a statue, barely breathing, barely blinking. When I ask her to adjust her expression, she looks at me with such hatred that my hand trembles. I do not capture what I see in her face. I capture what I feel emanating from her soul, and it is cold and furious beyond measure." In a later letter, dated October 20th, Chase wrote, "I have had the most disturbing experience. Today, while painting her eyes, I felt as though she were looking not at me but through me into some dark future. When the session ended and she departed, I remained to work on the background. I swear upon my reputation that when I turned back to the canvas, the expression had changed. Lips, which I had painted in a neutral line, seemed to curve downward. A trick of the light, surely. But I have painted hundreds of portraits, and never before have I felt that my subject continued to sit after she had left the room." Chase completed the portrait on November 3, 1872. He collected his fee, arranged for the painting to be hung in the Eastern Gallery, and left Newport that same day. He would never paint another portrait of a woman. In his memoirs, published years later, he devoted exactly 1 paragraph to the Ashworth Commission, concluding with the cryptic line, "Some subjects are better left unpainted, some souls better left unexamined." The portrait hung in the Eastern Gallery, and the strangeness began immediately. The first incident was reported by a housemaid named Sarah Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had been with the family for 3 months. According to her testimony, given years later to a local priest, she had been dusting the gallery one morning when she felt the overwhelming sensation of being watched. When she turned to look at the portrait, Mrs. Ashworth's eyes, which had been gazing slightly to the left, were now looking directly at her. Sarah ran from the room and refused to enter the gallery again. Harrison Ashworth dismissed her the following day, accusing her of hysteria and superstition. But Sarah Brennan was only the first. Over the next 20 years, as Harrison and Margaret's marriage settled into cold coexistence, the reports multiplied. A butler claimed the portrait's eyes followed him as he walked the length of the gallery. A visiting cousin swore she saw the painted hands move, the fingers tightening as though gripping something invisible. The family's children, twin sons born in 1874, refused to go near the Eastern Gallery, claiming the lady in the picture was angry at them. Margaret herself never commented on the portrait. She spent increasing amounts of time alone in her chambers, leaving Thornfield only for mandatory social engagements. The servants reported hearing her talking to herself late at night, long conversations conducted in a voice that alternated between pleading and rage. In 1893, Harrison Ashworth died of a stroke in his study. He was 61 years old. His will stipulated that Thornfield Manor should pass to his eldest son, Edmund, but that Margaret was to retain full control of the estate until her own death. She was 44 years old and would live another 32 years. After Harrison's death, Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic. She ordered the Eastern Gallery locked. No one was permitted to enter except herself. She kept the only key on a chain around her neck. Servants reported seeing lamplight under the gallery door at all hours of the night. Sometimes they heard her voice, talking to someone inside. But she lived alone. The twins, Edmund and Charles, had both left Newport by this time. Edmund had moved to New York to manage the family's business interests. Charles had fled even farther, settling in San Francisco after a scandal involving another man that the family had paid handsomely to keep quiet. Neither son returned to Thornfield while their mother lived. Margaret Ashworth died in 1925 at the age of 76. She was found in the Eastern Gallery, seated in a chair directly facing the portrait. She had been dead for approximately 12 hours. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the physician who examined the body noted in his report, never filed officially but discovered later in his personal papers, that her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The key to the gallery was still around her neck. When Edmund Ashworth finally returned to Thornfield to settle his mother's estate, he found a house that had been effectively abandoned. Margaret had dismissed most of the staff over the years, until only a cook and a single housemaid remained. The rooms were thick with dust, the gardens had gone wild, and the Eastern Gallery remained locked. Edmund was 51 years old, a pragmatic businessman who had spent his adult life fleeing the Gothic atmosphere of his childhood home. He arrived with his wife, Catherine, a sensible woman from Philadelphia society who regarded the tales about Thornfield with aristocratic skepticism. My husband's family subscribed to superstitious nonsense. Catherine later wrote in her diary, and I was determined to introduce rationality to the proceedings. Edmund used a locksmith's tools to open the gallery door. The hinges shrieked from disuse. The smell that emerged was of stale air and something else, something indefinably wrong that made both Edmund and Catherine step back involuntarily. The gallery was exactly as it had been when Margaret died. The chair still sat facing the portrait, and there, at the far end of the room, the painting watched them enter. Catherine's diary entry from that day, October 17, 1925, is preserved in the Newport Historical Society archives. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in curses. I do not believe that paint and canvas can contain anything more than pigment and cloth. Yet when I stood in that gallery and looked at the portrait of Margaret Ashworth, I felt something I cannot adequately describe. The woman in the painting was watching us, not with painted eyes that create the optical illusion of following movement, but with genuine awareness. She knew we were there, and she was not pleased. Edmund decided the portrait should be removed and sold. It was, after all, a genuine William Merritt Chase, worth a considerable sum. He hired an art appraiser from Boston, a Mr. Theodore Whitmore, who arrived on October 20th. Whitmore examined the portrait for 2 hours, taking notes, studying the brushwork, verifying Chase's signature. His final appraisal valued the painting at $12,000, a significant sum in 1925. But his report included a strange addendum. I must note an unusual phenomenon. While examining the portrait, I experienced the distinct sensation that the subject was aware of my scrutiny. On 3 separate occasions, I observed what appeared to be subtle changes in the facial expression, particularly around the eyes and mouth. I attribute this to the exceptional skill of the artist, who had captured his subject with uncanny vitality. Nevertheless, I left the gallery feeling profoundly unsettled. Edmund listed the portrait for sale. 3 different collectors came to Thornfield to view it. All 3 declined to purchase. The first collector, an elderly woman from New York who owned one of the finest private art collections in America, stood in front of the portrait for less than 5 minutes before walking out of the gallery. She told Edmund she had changed her mind and departed Thornfield immediately, her chauffeur later reporting that she had seemed badly shaken. The second collector, a museum director from Philadelphia, brought a photographer to document the painting. The photographer took 12 pictures using a large format camera and professional lighting. When the plates were developed, 11 showed the portrait clearly. But in the 12th photograph, taken last, the figure in the painting appeared blurred, as though she had moved during the exposure. The photographer swore he had not moved the camera. The exposure time had been identical to the previous shots. There was no rational explanation. The museum director withdrew his offer. The third collector was an eccentric millionaire from Chicago named Vincent Merritt. Unlike the previous viewers, Merritt believed in the supernatural. He had built his fortune in meatpacking and spent it on occult artifacts, haunted objects, and anything that might prove the existence of life beyond death. Merritt stood in the Eastern Gallery for over an hour, studying the portrait with obvious fascination. He walked back and forth across the room, watching the eyes follow him. He brought his face close to the canvas, examining every brushstroke. "I'll give you 20,000 for it," he told Edmund, "double the appraisal, but I have one condition. I want to spend the night alone in this room with the painting." Edmund, desperate to be rid of the thing, agreed. Merrick's experiment began at 9 o'clock on the evening of November 3, 1925. Exactly 3 years to the day after William Merritt Chase completed the portrait. Whether Merrick knew this date's significance is unclear. Whether it mattered is not. Edmund and Catherine retired to their chambers on the 3rd floor. The servants had been given the night off. Thornfield Manor was silent except for the Atlantic wind that rattled the windows and the grandfather clock in the entrance hall that marked each passing hour with sonorous chimes. At midnight, Catherine woke to screaming. The sound was coming from the Eastern Gallery. Not words, just raw vocalization, terror given voice. Edmund grabbed a lamp and they ran through the dark corridors. Catherine's diary recounting how the house itself seemed to resist their progress. Doors sticking, shadows deepening, the distance, the gallery stretching impossibly long. When they finally reached the gallery door, the screaming had stopped. The silence was worse. Edmund threw open the door. The lamp he carried illuminated the scene in stark contrasts of light and shadow. Vincent Merrick sat on the floor with his back against the far wall, as far from the portrait as the room's dimensions allowed. His eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth hung open, his hands clutched at his chest. He was having a heart attack. They summoned a doctor, but Merrick died before medical help could arrive. The official cause of death was myocardial infarction, sudden cardiac arrest brought on by extreme stress. He was 48 years old with no prior history of heart disease. Before he died, Merrick spoke only once, his words witnessed by both Edmund and Catherine. He stared at the portrait hanging in the darkness at the gallery's end and whispered, "She came out. She came out of the painting and she touched me. Then he died." The police investigated Merrick's death as a formality. There was no evidence of foul play. The man had clearly suffered a heart attack. Case closed. But the detective who led the investigation, a Lieutenant Patrick O'Brien, included an unusual note in his report. While investigating the scene, I observed the portrait in question. Though I am not a superstitious man, I found the painting profoundly disturbing. The subject's expression seemed to change depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. I cannot in good conscience recommend this artwork for public display. Edmund Ashworth had the gallery door locked again. He put Thornfield Manor on the market. The asking price was reduced 3 times over the next 18 months. Finally, in 1927, the estate sold for a fraction of its value to a developer who planned to demolish the mansion and subdivide the property. But the sale contract included a specific clause, insisted upon by Edmund. The portrait in the Eastern Gallery was not included. It would remain with the Ashworth family. Edmund had the painting crated and moved to a storage facility in Providence. It would remain there, untouched, for the next 46 years. The portrait might have remained forgotten if not for Laura Ashworth, Edmund's granddaughter, who became fascinated with her family's dark history in the 1970s. Laura was 28 years old in 1973, a graduate student in art history at Yale, and she had grown up hearing whispered fragments about the haunted painting that had driven her great-grandmother mad. When Edmund died in 1971, at the age of 97, his will included instructions regarding the portrait. It was to be destroyed. Burned, the ashes scattered. He had lived his entire adult life knowing the painting existed in storage, like a bomb that might detonate at any moment, and he wanted it ended. Laura contested the will. As an art historian, she argued the painting was too valuable to destroy, both monetarily and historically. A court eventually ruled in her favor. The portrait was hers. She had it moved to her apartment in New Haven in the summer of 1973. She planned to study it, document it, perhaps even write her dissertation on the phenomenon of allegedly haunted artwork. She was intelligent, educated, rational. She did not believe in ghosts. Her journal entries from that summer tell a different story. July 8, 1973, picked up the portrait today. Even the storage facility workers seemed relieved to be rid of it. One of them, an older man, told me his father had worked at the same facility and had always refused to enter the room where the Ashworth portrait was kept. Nothing good in there, his father had said. I thanked him for his superstitious nonsense and brought my great-great-grandmother home. July 10th, set up the portrait in my study. It's quite beautiful, actually. Chase's technique is masterful. The way he's captured the fabric of the dress, the subtle modeling of the face. But I admit there's something in the eyes. They're very dark, very intense. I've been working in the study for hours, and occasionally I forget it's there, and then I'll look up suddenly, and there she is. Watching, it's disconcerting. July 15th, having trouble sleeping. Keep having dreams about the portrait. In the dreams, Margaret steps out of the frame and walks around my apartment, touching my things, reading my books. When I try to speak to her, she turns to look at me and her expression is, I don't have words for it. Hunger, maybe, or rage that's been compressed for a century until it's become something else entirely. Woke up at 3 a.m. convinced someone was standing beside my bed. The apartment was empty, of course. July 22nd. I've started covering the portrait with a sheet when I leave the room. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I'm a doctoral candidate, not a superstitious servant. But I can't shake the feeling that she doesn't like being watched. Or rather, she doesn't like being watched by someone who can't watch her back constantly. August 3rd. Set up a camera to document the portrait continuously over a 24-hour period. I want to see if there's any objective evidence of the changes people claim to observe. Used a 16mm Bolex with a time-lapse mechanism, 1 frame every 60 seconds for a full day. August 5th. Developed the film. The results are, I don't know what the results are. For the most part, the portrait appears static, exactly as expected. But there are several sequences where something seems off. The shadows on the face appear to shift in ways that don't correspond to the unchanging lighting setup. In frames 312 through 328, spanning just over 15 minutes around 2 a.m., the mouth definitely looks different. I've examined these frames under magnification. The corners of the lips curve downward, creating an expression of profound sadness or anger. In the next frame, the expression has returned to neutral. August 8th. I showed the film to my advisor, Professor Hemmings. He suggested I was seeing patterns in random variations of light and shadow, a kind of pareidolia. When I insisted the changes were real and measurable, he expressed concern about my mental state. Suggested I was perhaps too emotionally invested in the project because of the family connection. He may be right. I've barely slept in weeks. August 12th. Something happened last night that I cannot explain rationally. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in my study. Soft footsteps, like someone barefoot on the wooden floor. I was terrified, but I made myself get up and investigate. The study door was closed as I'd left it. I opened it slowly. The room was dark, except for the streetlight coming through the window. The portrait was uncovered. I don't remember removing the sheet, but I must have. And I swear on everything I value, that Margaret Ashworth was not in the frame. The painted background was there, the empty dress was there, but the figure herself was gone. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering, scanning the dark room for movement. Then something made me look at the window. There was a reflection in the glass, a woman in a white dress standing behind me. I spun around, nothing. When I looked back at the portrait, Margaret was there again in her proper place, watching me with what I can only describe as satisfaction. August 14th. I called my mother today and asked her what she knew about Margaret Winthrop Ashworth. She was reluctant to discuss it, said grandfather Edmund had forbidden anyone to speak about it. Margaret considered the whole thing a shameful family secret, but eventually she told me what she knew. Margaret had been married against her will, to a brutal man. Harrison Ashworth was known for his violent temper and his cruel treatment of anyone he considered beneath him, which included his wife. Margaret had tried to leave him twice. Both times, he found her and brought her back. In that era, a married woman had no legal rights, no independent existence. She was her husband's property. Margaret spent 53 years trapped in that marriage in that house. When my mother finished telling me this, she said something that chilled me. Whatever you think you're accomplishing with that portrait, Laura, I promise you Margaret doesn't want to be studied. She wants to be freed. August 18th. I've decided to give the portrait to a museum. The Rhode Island School of Design has a strong American art collection, and they've expressed interest. The curator I spoke with assured me it would be properly cared for and displayed. I told myself this was the right decision, the scholarly decision, but I think the truth is I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what might happen if I keep the painting any longer. Last night I dreamed Margaret told me she's been waiting for someone to understand, someone to listen. When I woke up, my study door was open and there were wet footprints on the floor, even though it hadn't rained and all my windows were closed. The footprints led from the portrait to my bedroom door. Laura Ashworth delivered the portrait to the Rhode Island School of Design Museum on August 22, 1973. The museum staff cataloged it, photographed it for their records, and placed it in climate-controlled storage while they prepared a gallery space for display. The painting never made it to that gallery. 3 weeks after its arrival, a security guard making his nightly rounds reported a disturbance in the storage area. He heard what sounded like someone crying, a woman's voice echoing through the aisles of crated artwork. When he investigated, he found nothing, but the climate control system in that section had failed, and the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The guard's report noted that he felt an overwhelming sense of dread and depression while in that aisle, so severe that he had to leave the area. The climate control failure was attributed to mechanical malfunction and repaired, but it failed again 3 days later, and again the week after that. Each time, the failure was isolated to the storage section where the Ashworth portrait was kept. Museum staff began reporting nightmares. A preparator who had handled the portrait woke one night to find herself standing in her kitchen with no memory of getting out of bed, a knife in her hand. A curator who had been responsible for authenticating the painting started having panic attacks so severe she had to take medical leave. In October 1973, the museum's director made a decision that had no precedent in the institution's history. The Ashworth portrait was removed from the collection. It was too disruptive, too problematic, too dangerous to keep. Laura Ashworth was contacted. She refused to take it back. By this point, she had withdrawn from her doctoral program and moved to California, as far from New England as she could get. In a letter to the museum, she wrote, "I want nothing more to do with that painting or my family's history. Do whatever you think is appropriate, but do not send it to me." The museum contacted several other institutions. None were willing to accept it once they learned its history. Private collectors were approached. All declined. Finally, the museum arranged for the portrait to be returned to storage in Providence, to the same facility that had housed it for 46 years. But this time, additional precautions were taken. The painting was sealed in a custom-built crate with no windows or openings. The crate was placed in a locked room in the facility's basement. The room had no windows, no climate control, no electricity. The portrait has remained there ever since, 51 years in darkness, but the story doesn't end there. In 1998, a team of paranormal investigators convinced the storage facility's management to let them examine the portrait. The team was led by Dr. Raymond Pierce, a parapsychologist from Duke University who had spent 30 years studying allegedly haunted objects. Pierce's credentials were legitimate. He held a doctorate in psychology and had published extensively on the intersection of belief systems and anomalous experiences. The investigation took place over 3 nights in October 1998. Pierce's team brought sophisticated equipment: electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, audio recording devices, and HEIS, bead film cameras capable of capturing minute changes. Pierce's final report, published in the Journal of Parapsychology in 2000, remains one of the most controversial documents in the field. The report included electromagnetic readings that showed significant fluctuations in the portrait's immediate vicinity, temperature variations of up to 15 degrees within a 6-foot radius of the painting, and audio recordings of what Pierce classified as possible voice phenomena. But it was the photographic evidence that caused the most debate. Pierce's team took over 3,000 photographs of the portrait using HEIS, bead cameras set to capture one frame every 10 seconds. In over 90 7% of the photographs, the portrait appeared normal. But in the remaining images, approximately 87 photographs, the figure of Margaret Ashworth showed distinct variations. In some images, her eyes were closed. In others, her head was turned at a different angle. In 12 photographs taken over a span of approximately 20 minutes on the investigation's second night, the painted figure appeared to be crying, with visible tears on her cheeks. Pierce's report concluded, "While we cannot definitively prove that the Ashworth portrait is haunted in any supernatural sense, we can document that the painting exhibits properties that current scientific understanding cannot fully explain. Whether these properties result from some unknown aspect of the artist's technique, from environmental factors, or from something more metaphysical, remains an open question." The storage facility declined to permit any further investigations. The portrait remains sealed in its crate, in its locked room, in the basement. Laura Ashworth died in 2008 at the age of 63 from pancreatic cancer. In her will, she left instructions that the portrait should never be displayed, never be sold, never be studied. She established a trust fund specifically to pay the storage fees in perpetuity. As long as the money holds out, the portrait will remain where it is, locked away in darkness, waiting. The story of Margaret Ashworth's portrait remains a disturbing reminder that sometimes the line between art and reality, between representation and presence, is thinner than we believe. William Merritt Chase created a masterpiece of portraiture, capturing his subject with such skill that the painting seems alive. But what if his skill was not the only factor? What if Margaret Ashworth, trapped in a loveless marriage, brutalized and silenced, somehow channeled her rage and her grief into those hours of sitting for her portrait? What if, in some way we cannot understand, she found a method of escape from her flesh and blood prison into canvas and paint? But questions remain, questions that haunt anyone who investigates this case. What really happened during those 6 weeks in 1872 when Chase painted Margaret? What did he see in her that made him abandon portrait painting afterward? What occurred on the night Vincent Merrick died, alone in that gallery with the portrait? What were the wet footprints Laura Ashworth found in her apartment? And most troubling of all, what happens to the painting in that dark room, in that sealed crate, with no one watching? To this day, the storage facility staff who work near that basement room report strange experiences. Cold spots that appear without explanation, the sound of crying that seems to come from nowhere, and some swear they can feel someone watching them as they pass that locked door, a gaze that follows them through solid walls and thick wood, eyes that have been watching, waiting, observing for 152 years. And on silent nights, when the wind comes off Narragansett Bay and the old buildings of Providence creak and settle, one might wonder if Margaret Ashworth finally found what she was looking for. Did she escape her painted prison? Is she walking through the world now, freed at last? Or is she still there, still trapped, still waiting for someone to understand, someone to truly see her not as a painted figure, but as a woman who suffered, who endured, who refused to be forgotten? The portrait has not been photographed since 2000. The last image we have shows a woman in a white dress, her dark eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's lens, her expression hovering between sorrow and rage. The artist captured something that transcended mere technical skill. Whether it was Margaret's soul, her hatred, her longing, or simply the echo of a life unlived, we may never know. If this journey through one of America's most haunted artifacts resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of art and suffering, the weight of family secrets, and the question of whether objects can truly harbor something of the people who touched them, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own experiences with family secrets, haunted objects, or portraits that seem to watch you when you're not looking. Have you ever encountered artwork that made you uncomfortable? Do you believe objects can be haunted? Until next time, remember that history is not always about what we can see and measure. Sometimes the most profound truths exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, in the portraits that watch us when we're not looking, and in the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible and what is not. This has been the Untold Hour. Thank you for joining us in the darkness.